Hey everybody, welcome to Unwriting the Bible. I just finished talking with Dr. Raymond F. Person Jr., and man, what a fun conversation. If you don't know who Dr. Person is, he is professor of religion at Ohio Northern University. He holds a Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible and Semitic Studies from Duke University, and is widely known for his interdisciplinary work at the intersection of biblical studies, oral tradition, and conversation analysis. Dr. Person's research explores how oral culture and cognitive-linguistic processes shaped the transmission of biblical texts in ancient Israel. His writing has helped many, including me, rethink how we understand the formation of Scripture, the identity of the Bible, and how we should read it all. Some of his key publications include the Deuteronomic history and the book of Chronicles, Scribal works in an oral world, from conversation to oral tradition, and most recently, Scribal memory and word selection, the text criticism of the Hebrew Bible. He's also co-edited volumes like Empirical Models Challenging Biblical Criticism and Deuteronomy in the Pentateuch, Hexateuch, and Deuteronomistic history. This was a very special conversation for me because Dr. Person was one of the very first people who helped me see that I wasn't just chasing my tail in these studies. Ph.D. work can feel like swimming in a sea of imposter syndrome. And Dr. Person was kind enough to look at some of my work and help redirect some of my work and just kind of give me just a little bit of needed encouragement at the right time. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did with Dr. Ray Person. Well, Dr. Person, welcome to Unwriting the Bible. And as we talked briefly before I pushed record, I am just so excited and grateful for the opportunity to talk with you and really to add your voice to this, what I hope to be a repository of just words on oral tradition, media studies, whatever that field is going to end up whatever it's going to end up being, and just how it intersects with the Hebrew Bible.
Good. I'm glad to be here.
So we talked a bit about what we would dive into, and I really want, and I'm going to say this later on in our discussion, that your voice, that as much as I've read, as much as I've been able to dive into the field, and really the fields, what for me is the two fields of oral traditional studies, what used to be called orality studies, what it seems to be moving toward maybe media studies or media criticism. This field, launching from Perry and Lord through John Miles Foley and everyone after Foley, and then just the study of the Hebrew Bible, the Venn diagram of that intersection. I know you bring other fields into that as well, but your voices seem to be such a nuanced, broad voice, and so yeah, I'm very excited to hear you in this conversation. And so here's the question I thought we would launch in, is to even see where you got into this conversation in the first place. And so how I wrote the question down for our memory aid for our oral performance here is Brian B. Schmidt once lamented that the implications of the predominantly oral nature of the culture in which the Bible was birthed have made only sporadic and gradual inroads into the modern study of early Israelite society, the Hebrew Bible, and the relevance of orality and literacy for the actual historical composition of biblical literature. And that has for sure been my experience. When I decided I was going to go the route of oral traditional studies in my Ph.D. in Old Testament studies, nobody knew what I was talking about. Like, if it wasn't Herman Gunkel, then it was, oral tradition, that's just like the telephone game. And so, there was no Perry and Lord who, maybe some people actually had heard of Walter Ong, which was interesting, but not John Miles Foley, and everything stemming from him. And so I'm curious, first of all, has that been your experience with your approach to biblical studies, biblical criticism? And how did you first discover this broader conversation, this world of scholarship from Perry and Lord and John Miles Foley? And then how did that conversation begin to intersect with your study of the Hebrew Bible?
Good. Well, I first encountered the academic study of the Bible at Phillips University, where I went to college and seminary. And the two most important professors there were Gene Boring in the New Testament and Leo Perdue in Old Testament. And so they had an influence. And I learned a lot at the time about oral tradition from the more traditional form critical view. And I also, they encouraged me to take a lot of classes in English, and including literary theory and a variety of things. And I had this intuition that biblical scholars were uncritical when they talked about oral tradition. I knew enough about comparative literature because of those classes. It was kind of like, I need to find out more about oral tradition. So when I went to Duke, that's one of the things I really wanted to do in my Ph.D. program. And I found Ong and Lord and Havelock and some of those kind of on my own. And I actually talked to graduate students at Duke in English history and religion to say, who can help me with this? Because we were required to have a minor outside the religion department. And I ended up working with William O'Barr in linguistic anthropology. And he looked at what I had read, and at first he kind of dismissed it in the sense that, well, you've learned enough about that. You can't know anything about oral traditions if you don't know the most basic form of communication, that is conversation. So he started me on a path of looking at conversation analysis and sociolinguistics. But it was in the service of my trying to get a handle on oral tradition. And so he also encouraged me to look for kind of postdoc situations where I could study conversation analysis with people in the field. And before I could do that, I saw an NEH summer seminar on oral tradition and literature hosted by John Miles Foley, who at the time I really didn't know much about. And so in 1992, I spent the summer in Columbia, Missouri with 29 other PhDs studying with Foley in a very comparative method. And he brought in 1 week, so it's a 6-week seminar. We spent 1 week on the Bible, and he brought in a guest lecturer, Werner Kelber. So it was my first time to meet Werner. And so this started a relationship. And the book that I was working on during that 6 weeks was my book, In Conversation with Jonah, which was really the first time I had tried to apply conversation analysis to literature. And John Miles Foley read every chapter of that book during that summer. He gave me feedback. And he encouraged me a lot in relationship to how conversation analysis might be another way of understanding something about oral traditions. And during that seminar, we were studying the Iliad. And since I know Greek, I went to some of the Greek, and an idea just jumped off the page when I was reading it in English, and I looked at it. And when I met with him for our weekly meeting, I said, I have an idea for a research project on Homer. I told him what it was, and he said, you've got a great idea, you should do that. So I actually wrote an article on Homer while I was with him. And that was published in Greek, Roman, and Byzantine Studies. And again, it was applying the Perry Lord method of the comparative study of oral traditions and conversation analysis. So it was the first time anyone had brought those two things together.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
uh, so, so I had this intuition. I kind of tried to figure out more about that from a comparative perspective, including kind of a linguistic perspective. And in some ways, that intuition led me to a lot of luck. I mean, I knew nothing about conversation analysis, and Bar said, well, you need to learn this. And so that opened up the world. Then in 2001, I was able to do a linguistic summer institute with the Linguistic Society of America in Santa Barbara, which is one of the big places for conversation analysis in terms of doctoral study. And I ended up working with 4 of the leading scholars in conversation analysis, which turned out to be another 6-week postdoc experience. So I had some one-on-one time with Emmanuel Shegloff, John Heritage, Don Zimmerman, and Gene Lerner. So those are all the influences, and a lot of it was just luck. I mean, I got some good advice from some people, but a lot of it was just luck. But I also, once I saw some of this, I knew I was onto something. And frankly, I can be pretty stubborn. I had trouble early on getting some of my publications accepted because no one knew what to do with it.
Yes,
And
right.
I
Right.
just stuck with it. And,
Yeah.
30 years later, here I am. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I've submitted a couple of articles for publication, and they came back with understandable biases against, well, we don't know this about orality. This could be true also about texts. Like, yes, but you're missing the new. Anyway, but you're blowing my mind because it's funny. My introduction to you was very different than your path because I hit you square in the face of when I finally, I think what happened as I was going through this oral traditional deal, I was first introduced through a book on the historicity of the synoptic tradition by Greg Boyd and Paul Rhodes Eddy. It's called Lord or Legend. And while they're talking about the historicity of the synoptic tradition, they bring in oral tradition as a way of talking about how oral history is kept. But of course, oral history is kind of different than oral traditional studies. So they bring in. I don't remember how much they talk about Foley, but they definitely represent a lot of Foley's ideas. Laurie Honko was really big for them, for demonstrating that long epics are possible through oral traditions. But I think my first introduction to you was in this book that you edited. My supervisor said, since you're looking at some scholarly approaches that may move against the flow of empirical models of biblical criticism, here's a book you might want to look at. And so the book that you edited there, or co-edited, and your article in there was, I think that was my first introduction to you. Did some research. Of course, I found your article, Israelite Scribe as Performer, I think is the title. And then your article in contextualizing Israel's sacred writings. And then, of course, I jumped in and got your monograph. And so I entered straight through the intersection of oral traditional studies as I was understanding them at the time anyway, and biblical studies. But you came in through kind of and I thought the conversation analysis, I thought that was like a new field you were breaking into but that was your entry point, huh?
Well, I mean, like I said, I had read Ong and Lord and
Right, right,
Havelock
right,
and
right,
those before, and I was
right.
interested in that. But Bar, when I showed him the list of things I had read about oral tradition, his response was, "That's enough of that." Now, he also, I will say, he introduced me to Richard Bauman And Dennis Tedlock, I mean, he introduced me to some of the folks who do that kind of field work from an anthropological perspective. So he did some of that. He did broaden my understanding of oral traditions in relationship to that. But he also theoretically said you can't understand oral traditions until you understand everyday face-to-face conversation, which is the most basic form of language, and then everything else is an adaptation of that. And so that's what got me into conversation analysis early. Now, I will say, for a long time, I had kind of three research tracks: the more traditional, historical, critical, biblical studies, conversation analysis, and comparative study of oral traditions. And it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that all three of those streams of my research are coming together. That is, I might pair up two of them in the past, but all three of them coming together, frankly, that took me a while to figure out how to do that. I was
Yeah.
methodologically, it was complicated enough that I could work with two at a time, but bringing all three of them together is really a more recent event. So most people who know my work in biblical studies do not know much about my work in conversation analysis. And so it would not be surprising to me that if people are
Right.
reading my more recent work in conversation analysis, applied especially to text criticism, it's kind of like, where did this come from? Well,
Right.
in one sense, I've been doing that for a long time, but some of my work in conversation analysis, I have an article on Shakespeare, an article on Homer. I have a book that I'm dealing with modern English short stories. That is, I've been trying to work out my methodology in lots of places. And frankly, English literature was easier to do because I didn't have to translate studies in conversation analysis from English to ancient Hebrew.
Yeah,
I,
right.
so part of my method, working a lot of that out, took me far afield from biblical studies. And so it's trying to figure that out and how to bring that back to biblical studies. And that's been happening over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, well, you've got your most recent book published. That was published in 2023, right?
Yeah, the scribal memory and word selection. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
And
that
then,
that heavily combines the comparative study of oral traditions and conversation analysis and applies it to a very technical issue of text criticism and so-called variants in the biblical
right.
text, right?
Right. Right. Well, then I've got your an article that you wrote, Scribal Memory and Metonymy in Iron Age Judah, with some discussion of Deuteronomy and the, is it
Lachish letters. Yeah,
Lachish letters?
yeah.
So much of my study has been done online and reading. Like with my French and German, I have no idea how to pronounce any of it, And so, unfortunately, that's true of a lot of my pronunciations of proper terms and names. But yeah, like I love that in the article, the way you bring it together, and maybe we're getting the cart before the horse here, but how basically you say in conversation analysis, when you're referring to something to reference, there's a priority of actually getting the reference right, and then of brevity, if possible, right? And then we see that, and then you bring that into the oral traditional studies of multiformity, that there's no such thing as an original in an oral traditional culture. It's just, is it in line with the tradition, right? and so is it accepted by the tradition, then that is original, right? And so you bring that in with then looking at ways that we refer to, like Jeremiah or the son of Hezekiah. I forget the name on the Bulai. But anyway, like there's sometimes it's Jeremiah, son of this guy, or Jeremiah from, but the reference is provided by what's needed, what's known between the performer and the audience, not by what's the original text or whatever. Is that a good kind of a brief summary of what you were doing there?
Yeah, so multiformity in oral traditions is that the same epic, when anytime it is performed, is not exactly the same from our highly literate perspective in terms
Mm-hmm.
that the words may be different. There might even be a different order of the telling at times. Um,
Right.
so multiformity in oral traditions allows for a certain textual fluidity and so forth, right? And
Uh-huh.
what I do is pick that up and I apply it early in my work to the passages in Kings that are copied into both
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah and Jeremiah,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to looking at Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles and those connections. And then, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I mean, I've done some stuff here and there in terms of the Synoptic Gospels where that's kind of an obvious thing to do as too, those kind of
Sure.
parallel texts.
Right.
And
Right.
so it raises the question, what we see as differences,
Uh-huh.
would the ancients see that as different or the same?
Uh-huh.
Because oral traditions allow for multiformity. And so the whole definition, the whole concept of what is the same and what is different is culturally determined.
Uh-huh.
So that complicates our whole discussion of text criticism, source criticism, redaction criticism, and so forth,
It's
because we're
such a
not
big
dealing,
deal.
it
Yeah.
is, it's a big deal, because we're
Yeah.
not dealing with one original text that then has this kind of genetic family tree that trickles down to some kind of multiformity. No, you start with the multiformity, and then the
Right.
tradition limits it further to come up with an authoritative text, eventually saying this is what we think the text should be, right?
Right.
So
Right. Right.
it's just reversing the pyramid in one
Uh-huh.
sense.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, the other thing that you're pointing out is metonymy, that is how the
Mm-hmm.
part can represent the whole.
Right.
And if you think about, well, for Christians, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus quotes the first line of a psalm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not,
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
yeah, and that's
Yeah.
not supposed to be simply that first line. It's a way of, in one
Right.
sense, referring to the whole psalm, right?
Yeah.
So, and I would say the Shema in Jewish tradition, "Hear, O Israel, our
Hmm.
Lord is one," and that represents the entire Torah. It's not
Right.
so and then I argue that in Deuteronomy we have things where, the law is written on a stele. Well, it's not the entire book of Deuteronomy. It's certainly not the entire
Hmm.
Torah,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it represents the entirety. So the entirety
Right.
doesn't even have to be there, right?
Right.
So that metonymic quality is something that we find in oral traditions, and it makes sense for me in terms of the Hebrew Bible.
Uh-huh. And the example I always come back to is it's just an easy example, at least for someone who has had a relatively some kind of relative time in the Christian tradition, is if someone is going through a really hard time, you pat them on the back and you say, "Hey, remember the Lord is our shepherd." Like, you haven't just said, "Hey, God's going to treat you like a shepherd treats a sheep." Like, you have activated all of Psalm 23, at least the first part that everybody knows, you know,
Yep.
and maybe even activated John 10, Jesus the good shepherd. But you've activated, hey, what you've actually said is you can trust God to take care of you. And I'm in this with you, even by saying that. And so you've spoken all of Psalm 23 and so much more by saying a handful of words, and that's what we have a tradition, but it's different for us in our modern Western hyper individualistic post Renaissance, post Gutenberg society. We have this expectation of individualism. We're not connected to our traditions like the ancient people in their traditional worlds were, when their identity was their community. And so it's a different it has a different weight and different power than it did for them, right? And you know,
Yeah, I would go so far to say that there's certainly a difference in degree, but the example you just gave also points to us that there's more of that happening in contemporary society than many of us often realize, right?
yes, yes,
And so, and I said that many of us realize, especially those of us who have PhDs and are highly literate, and we're so focused on the written text that we often lose
mm,
this other aspect of our culture that other people may be a lot more in touch with than we
right,
are, right? So
right,
I think that's part of the challenge for those of us who, for very good reasons, spend a lot of time with minutia in text to
mm-hmm,
get at that deeper meaning. And I'm certainly not discounting that. If you read if you read
mm,
my Scribal memory and word selection book, it's deeply technical. In fact, so technical that I fear a lot of people aren't going to read it, right?
yeah,
It requires a lot of you. I get it.
yes,
But
right,
those kinds of details are important, even if you then
mm,
step back from those details and say the vast majority of ancients wouldn't have cared about those details, right?
right, right, right,
So it's figuring out where we are as moderns and how we approach what we think is the same and what is different, and then
uh-huh,
trying to understand how the ancients would have thought of it differently to try to look at that even after we've studied all the minutia
uh-huh.
to see how the ancients might have understood it in their context.
Yeah, some of that the minutia studies helps us build a broad picture to enjoy. I think. I mean, if you don't learn Greek and Hebrew and analyze the verbs, you're not going to see how they interplay with themselves, or intertextually with another performance. And it's helpful. It's helpful. But yeah, the ultimate goal, I think, should be to step back to the goal isn't to examine the shade of bark on a single tree. The goal is to enjoy a walk through the forest. And sometimes it's good to step back. I was talking to a guy one time about this sort of thing, and he said something like, "Well, how can you believe anything is accurate at all in the Bible, like if they don't hold to our standards of exactitude?" And I looked at him, and this guy, he's a PhD. I think he does studies in Chicano history or Chicano literature. And but I said, dude, like, to say it in your terms, like, that's ethnocentrism. To think that only our approach to truth can hold any kind of value. Like, it was true for them, and it was true by our standards, by in some measures. But we can't measure their culture and their truth by our standards. If we're studying that, we need to step into their shoes and try to experience it from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, so, Dr. Person, this seems, and maybe I've just developed the neurological pathways that some of this stuff just runs easily through. It just seems like so apparent that this needs to be a constant part of our discussion in oral or in biblical studies. Why do you think the field of biblical studies has been so slow to explore these recent theories in oral traditions and media studies and conversation analysis?
Oh gosh, if the sociology of knowledge gets really interesting, and so for those of us in Hebrew Bible, um, Note comes out with this idea of the Deuteronomistic history, and
Mm-hmm.
the Germans and Europeans come up with three redactors, and the
Uh-huh.
Americans come up with two redactors. And for the
Uh-huh.
longest time, there was this huge divide. And why was that? Well, was because we were studying geographically close to people in the same language and so forth. I mean, there's a certain sociology. We learn from our teachers. We don't often stray too far from our teachers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's really not. But there's also a certain limiting feature to that, and it's only when you get some good cross-fertilization that actually starts to happen. I think part of what has happened is we've become more and more specialized in ways that's been to our detriment methodologically. And that specialization has meant that we've understand things deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of details. But I think one of the methodological problems is that the vast majority of scholars in biblical studies do not engage in good discussions about methodology with classicists, with Assyriologists, with Egyptologists, with other people who at least at one time were very adjacent. In fact, people who were doing biblical studies were doing all those other kinds of things too. There was a lot of discussion between those. Because a lot of people in ancient Near Eastern literature and languages and in Greek and Latin classics and so forth seem to understand what we're trying to do from the perspective of the comparative study of oral tradition better. And that's partly because they have changed their methodological assumptions along the way so that some of the things that we think we can do in terms of, identifying 6 redactional layers or whatever, is something that they used to think they could do, but they've given up on because they think it's methodologically unsound. And so we're not having those kinds of conversations in the same way that at one time the historical critical method kind of came into existence by the cross-fertilization of these fields, but then we became so specialized that we're not talking to each other as much. And the reason I know that is because, the reason I suspect that, I guess I should say, that's not everyone would share that opinion, but is because I formed a close relationship with the classicist, John Miles Foley. He also taught me a lot about Serbo-Croatian, and I read the Cid and the Song of Roland and a bunch of other things with him. It was kind of like, wait a minute, these other folks in ancient literature and medieval literature have a perspective that we need to pay close attention to, that most of us in biblical studies just don't read much of anything outside of biblical studies.
Right.
So you pointed earlier to the empirical models challenging biblical criticism. Well, that specifically included a more comparative approach, right? It includes Gilgamesh, it includes Surah prayers, it includes Dead Sea Scrolls, it includes the chapter from the New Testament. I mean, it was, by definition, it was to be more comparative, to bring in some of those perspectives. Because another thing that I find interesting, people who are very much involved in Dead Sea Scrolls are much more open to what we're doing in media studies because the material demands it. And text critics are increasingly open to that because the material demands it.
Yeah.
It's those of us who are still doing source and redaction criticism without being involved in these kinds of discussions. We might, well, I've had people say very clearly to me, well, the Hebrew Bible is so different than the Iliad and Gilgamesh and this, and so we have to study it on its own. Well, and there's a bit of truth to that.
Sure.
But once you've done that, then you miss the methodological innovations that are happening in other places that might actually bring some clarity to what it is we're doing.
Well, sure, and not only sure, and I think is what you point out in that your article in that work is when you read the text as if it's going to start with a solid original that slowly gets corrupted, what you're actually doing is bringing to that study our own culture of a typeset work done by a single author. That's how that works, and we can see that that's how that works. But what we do see, from what I understand from the reading the secondary sources who are citing the primary sources, what I understand is what we actually see in more traditional cultures is a more multiform tradition, very comfortable with what we call variations, but from their perspective is the same. And as time moves on, I don't know if I've read this or if it's just like what makes sense to me, a theory. As the community gets further and further separated from either the geographical or just the community of tradition, the text becomes so important as the connection to the ancient traditions that we have to solidify it. We have to set it. We can't change it because it's our connection. And so it starts more multiform, and for whatever reason, whether my theory is accurate or not, it becomes more solid as it goes. Like, yes, we have to read the Hebrew Bible within the cultural realities of Israel, which though there's bleed, Israel was not ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Babylon or Assyria. It was what it was, but it's still in that milieu. But whatever. Yes, we have to study them for what they are, but that doesn't mean that just means we bring in our own constructs to study them. Do you know what I'm saying? Like we say we're just going to study them on their own terms, but what we're really doing is bringing our terms to the study.
One of the studies that I found so interesting is reading studies by Anglo-Saxon scholars who could tell that there's a difference in the way that Anglo-Saxon scribes treated the Latin text versus the Anglo-Saxon text. That is, when they're dealing with the vernacular text, the Anglo-Saxon text, there's a lot more multiformity, there's a lot more textual fluidity, textual plurality, and so forth. When they're working with the Latin text, a dead language in one sense, or a highly liturgical language that, I mean, it's not the vernacular, it's a special language for scripture and so forth. They are much more exact in their copying of the tradition. But to some degree, that's because that tradition is not as alive as the vernacular tradition when they're copying the Anglo-Saxon tradition. That is, when they're copying Anglo-Saxon, the living oral tradition is giving them permission to copy the text with more fluidity, more multiform. Now, it seems to me that one of the mistakes we make in Hebrew Bible is we focus so much on the Masoretic text, which is a medieval text in a language that was not the vernacular.
Right.
So we're assuming that those Anglo-Saxon scribes in their approach to Latin, which is very similar to what the Masoretes' approach was to the Hebrew, is the way Hebrew text would have been when it was more vernacular in the ancient world.
Yeah, right.
And so and of course an interesting question is, when did Hebrew stop being a vernacular language so that the scribes would have had a different relationship to a Hebrew text versus whatever their vernacular language of the time was? And that gets complicated, and that's beyond my expertise. But that's an interesting question. And there's folks who know better than I, there's still a lot of debate about, the change from Hebrew to Aramaic and Aramaic to Greek and so forth. And I have a stake in those answers, but I don't have the expertise to contribute much to those conversations. But I think that helps us, that idea of the Anglo-Saxon scribes and how they treat the vernacular language versus an ancient language is enlightening, and we should be able to do more with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense. I mean, if I was going to sit down and copy my Greek New Testament, whereas if I was copying my NIV, like I'm going to be, I'm going to triple check every stroke and every accent mark of my copy in the Greek, and I'm not going to have any kind of synonyms, or anything I haven't heard it in a different Greek. I haven't heard a different translation of the Greek. It's going to be word for word, stroke by stroke, letter by letter. But I might mix up, a saying from Jesus I might add, if anyone wants to be my disciple, they must deny themselves, take up the cross, and follow me. I might add die daily as I'm copying, where I wouldn't do that with the Greek because I'm being very specific. I'm not just going to write die daily in Greek. I don't have that proficiency in Koine, So it makes perfect sense that as the tradition is moving beyond the vernacular. Yeah. But it is interesting, isn't it, that there's some kind of sense of originality, or at least I guess you don't like the word originality. I guess it would be more like what is true to the tradition, what is actually true to the tradition. Is that right?
Yeah, so here's where I think it's important for me to make very clear that even though I think it's very rare that we can identify what I would say is a true variant,
Mm-hmm.
okay?
Mm-hmm.
Or another way of thinking about that, where there's something that we understand as a difference that the ancients would also understand as a difference instead of the same. Okay.
Uh-huh.
I think it's
Yeah.
very difficult methodologically for us to make those kinds of distinctions. I
Mm-hmm.
would never conclude that no scribe ever made a mistake.
Uh-huh. Right.
I also
Right.
would not conclude that no scribe never made ideologically or theologically motivated changes.
Right. Right.
I think that's likely to have happened here and there. I'm not sure they would have gotten away with it because the tradition
Mm-hmm.
may have corrected it.
Right.
I also think because of that, it was so rare that tends to be our first explanation. As
Uh-huh.
biblical scholars, we assume any variant, it's because someone made a mistake, and we try to explain what the mistake was, or someone was consciously, intentionally changing the text for some theological reason.
Right.
And I think there's some good examples. I will say Bart Ehrman's Orthodox Corruption of Scripture is,
Uh-huh.
from a methodological perspective, quite interesting, and that he can
Mm.
point to here debates about this heresy, and we can see the debates occurring in these variants in the
Mm.
biblical text. Okay, that's great. I've heard some
Yeah.
papers, and I'm still trying to figure out where I heard this because I didn't take good notes. I've heard some papers on the Hebrew Bible where people did a similar kind of thing with debates among the rabbis and some
Mm.
variants. So I think it's possible to figure some of that out. I think
Right.
we often just assume that that's the answer, and the answer most of the time should be it's really not different. The ancients would have assumed it's the same.
Uh-huh.
Our highly literate post-Gutenberg minds assume that every change is either a mistake or somehow loaded with meaning, and it's
Right. Right.
not. With
Yeah.
multiformity, it doesn't matter, right?
Uh-huh.
Now, for Christians, I would say one thing that's clear for us, most of us have a preference when we say the Lord's Prayer for saying debts, trespasses, or sins, right?
Right.
But I don't think too many of us would argue that the people who are choosing something else have got the prayer all wrong. It's not the Lord's
Right.
Prayer anymore. No, it's the
Right.
Lord's Prayer. We allow for a certain degree of multiformity. It does the same thing. We might have personal
Mm.
preferences. We might even have some theological preferences. But most of
Sure.
us are not going to get too hung up on, oh gosh, that person
Right.
next to me said the wrong word, right?
Right.
Because it's just not, it doesn't have to be that exact.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's the mistake biblical scholars too often make, right?
Mm.
It has to
Mm.
be exact, and oh, there's some deep meaning in the change here, or
Yeah.
oh gosh, this was a mistake. I can't believe someone made that mistake, right?
Right.
No.
So the example that you give, and I forget the exact reference, is it's between Samuel and Chronicles, where I think Joab is off and like has a victory, and then in I think Samuel, it says that then David travels to the city and takes the crown from the king that was conquered. But I think in Chronicles it just says, and David took the crown. And you're like, and we say, well, how did he take the crown? He was still in Jerusalem or whatever, you know? And so in that case, like, that's a case where that's not a variant, right? Would you say that basically it's like, of course they knew, you didn't have to say it. It was implied by, it's a great example that I like to talk about too is how First and Second Chronicles actually tells the entire story of Genesis through Second Kings. It just tells a lot of it by genealogy. And in a traditional culture, when you say this person's name and this person's name and this person's name, you're telling the story. That every story is activated in the mind of the people hearing.
Yeah, and that's where metonymy comes in. Because if you say something, well, yeah, if you say someone's name and you're really familiar with the tradition, you know what that person, the events associated with that person and so forth are. So
Right.
yeah, it can be a shorthand way. And certainly we know this in living oral traditions, that genealogies, actually when they are told in oral traditions, it's never just a list of names. You'll give a name and then you'll talk about that ancestor in relationship to some story that leads to the next name. And so it tends to be very, very explicit. Now they can collapse that if they want to skip ahead a couple of generations or so to get to the next story that they're even more interested in. But it doesn't mean that they've rejected those stories they skipped over.
Right,
It's just,
right.
hey, we're not telling that story, we're telling other stories.
And in that case, Dr. Person, in that case, that's a case where a change is meaningful, right? Like if you tell the genealogy, I'm skipping over this person and I'm telling this person, I'm doing that intentionally. That's changing what I'm communicating. I'm not changing the tradition. I'm not saying something untrue, but I'm making a different point. So I'm telling the genealogy different for the point so what we call variations can have meaning, but maybe not always. we have to take those variations, what we call variations, in their terms. Is that right? Is that a good way to think about it?
I would say that kind of variation has meaning in that single performance. But that single performance does not define the meaning in the entire tradition, because every performance is part of the multiformity, and every performance, no matter how selective it is, has the metonymic quality to represent the tradition beyond itself. So even if you skip over something, you have not rejected it. It's just you're not mentioning it this time. Some other time you might mention it and skip over something else. It's not.
Yes.
It's not an attempt to omit anything.
Yes.
Right?
There's nothing corrective about it. It's just, I mean, maybe is it rhetorical? Is that a good word to say? It's a rhetorical choice and not a corrective choice.
That makes sense. In that moment, there might be some rhetorical function, but it's certainly not correcting the tradition and that the larger tradition is wrong and this becomes the authoritative way to talk about the tradition. No, this is one of many ways to talk about the tradition, and it might be the best way in this given moment for whatever reason. It would be interesting as a scholar to know what that is, but it might be the best in that particular moment. But every particular performance is by definition imperfect, incomplete, representative of the much larger tradition. So it's necessarily incomplete, but its incompleteness does not define anything about what was left out.
Mm-hmm.
and does not
Uh-huh.
necessarily value what was included more than what was left out.
I have
It's
a very
simply telling the tradition.
Yes, I have a very selfish question to ask. I'm
Okay.
stealing some time that we have here because I'm one of my favorite passages to bring up with um, uh, some of my brothers and sisters in Christ whom I love dearly, whom don't like my perspective on the text because I'm not a verbal plenary inspiration guy. Even though, like, anyway, I'm super. The Bible is my authority. Like, I submit to it completely, and I think that it's multiform. And goodness gracious, our triune God would want to preserve the Bible in His people communally, relationally, not just by possessing whatever. But one of my favorite passages or comparisons to bring up is, oh goodness, I believe it's in. Oh my goodness, you can fix me. I think it's First Chronicles and Second Samuel, the David's census. And so in Samuel, it says the Lord incited David to number the people. He does it and he gets in trouble, right? And then in Chronicles, it says Satan incited David to number the people. Now, the way I was taught to read the Bible said, well, what you have to do is realize that this is talking about basically jump over to Job and realize that Job talks about how Satan came into the courtroom with God. And so when it says Satan incited David, what it really means is God allowed Satan to incite David. And so we project what we know about the theological manual that tells us how the kingdom, how heaven works, project that into Chronicles, project that back into Samuel. And so when it says the Lord incited David, what it really meant is the Lord allowed Satan to incite David, and it clarified that in Chronicles. Like what I would say is, and this is where I think you need to correct me. I would say Samuel got it wrong, and Chronicles corrects the bad theology that that Samuel had. And what I would say then is, and we can learn more about those passages than just what it teaches us about God. Pulling out, we can see how God is patient with our bad theology, and God is faithful to always draw us to Him. And that's how I used to approach that, is say, hey, the text isn't wrong, it's right. It's right in how it corrects itself theologically, and even that correction teaches us not just the words on the page, but how the words got on the page teach us about God's patience and kindness and forbearance with us. So that's been a fun passage for me to talk about, and that's how I've approached it. So would you give me the Dr. Raymond F. Person Jr. absolute true way to handle that
Yeah, yeah.
variation?
You're calling me out on a passage I've not actually written on this but this is it's a good example. My take on that, based on mostly secondary literature, frankly,
Mm-hmm.
is that the idea of Satan is something that develops late in
Mm-hmm.
ancient Israel, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's very late in the biblical text.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and because of that, I would argue in that case, the Samuel text probably reflects the earlier reading. And
Mm-hmm.
then the Chronicles text represents a later reading.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas there's a number of passages in the Hebrew Bible where God is responsible for evil. It might be evil that
Yes.
he changed his mind about and didn't do, but
Right.
nevertheless, God is prepared to do evil.
Mm-hmm.
You can't miss that.
Good and evil come from God. He brings the rain. He brings the famine. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Yeah.
even the New Testament suggests that, right? So,
Yeah.
all right,
Sure. Yeah.
but certainly that's the case. But at some point in the history in ancient Israel, the evil kind of gets pulled out of God and put into the idea of Satan. And I would say that's
Mm-hmm.
under the influence probably of Zoroastrianism, a religion that we know about in the Persian period and so forth, where you end up with kind of a dualistic, a good God and an evil God and so forth. So I think in terms of the development of religious thought, I think we can locate that in history, in the text. And that's one of those places where the development of the idea of God and of Satan might help us put these two different readings in some kind of chronological order. Now, what do you do with that theologically? Well, you could argue the early one is the theologically sound one, or you could argue the later one is the theologically sound one. And I mean, and personally, I can be somewhat schizophrenic in my understanding of God, because lots of times I really like the God of Job. Which, it all comes from God, good and evil, and we just, and at other times, the God that I prefer to think of is the God of liberation theology, that is always the God of good, taking the side of the poor and the oppressed in the face of evil that God is not responsible for. Now, I change my mind on who God is at times based on my mood, which is often influenced by what's happening in the chaotic world in which I live. So I'm not, I'll just be, as a theologian, I am not consistent, but I don't have to be, because I'm a biblical scholar and the text is not consistent. So.
Yeah. Well, I think as a theologian, you're probably either, in your life, you're either consistent or honest. Which is my way of saying honest. We're always inconsistent. Yeah.
And I'm honestly inconsistent about a variety of things depending on my mood.
I don't know. That's what I meant to say. I don't know anybody who's always consistent with their theology. Hey, there's this just another aside. There's this great. Are you aware of a guy named Greg Boyd?
You mentioned him earlier, and
I think you'd be a big fan. He has like a very large church from in an Anabaptist tradition, and I know, but he's I think you'd really like him. I think you'd have some crossovers with him. He's got this great book. He's a theologian. He's got this great book called, actually it's a 2-volume work, The Crucifixion of the Warrior God. And he looks, his shtick is, we have to take seriously the fact that we see God most plainly in Jesus, and we see Jesus most clearly on the cross. And so we that has to be what we measure everything through. And so basically, I mean, this is so off topic. I'll email you about it. But I think you might really dig it. It's. I love his heart, and I love his. I really like his. He's a voice of reason and nuance in a world that's growing in polarity and hostility. I really appreciate his voice.
Well, since we attend First Mennonite Church in Bluffton, Ohio, maybe I should look into that and see what's what. I know a number of the other Mennonites who are involved in nonviolent atonement kinds of discussions. So.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dr. Person, I would love if you have time for 2 more questions. They overlap.
Okay.
Do you have time for that?
Okay.
The overlapping is, as you engage biblical scholars who try to engage this conversation, specifically the conversation for me of oral tradition media studies, where do you find that people mostly miss it? Because it's so hard. It's such a new perspective, new paradigm to dive into. It's easy to, the Great Divide theory, or we'll talk about memory and say, well, the oral traditions couldn't have that great of a memory, and there's so many different little cliffs to fall off. Where do you find that biblical scholars, as they engage this conversation, because you corrected me when you looked at a chapter in my dissertation, and I think I used the word variation, and you said remember, different means something different to them, and it was like, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, yes, So, so that, and then, like, it seems to me that this approach really should substantially transform biblical criticism from source criticism, redaction criticism, form criticism. I mean, even, the history of the Israelite religion. Like, what does it mean when it's a tradition that's growing and not just people rewriting their past willy-nilly? So those two questions. Where do you, when you do find biblical scholars diving into this conversation, where might they miss it? And what is your perspective on the impact these studies should have on biblical criticism at large? It's very small final questions.
Yeah.
Feel free to cut off whenever. Yeah.
So let me start by addressing that to things that I have said to my colleagues who are very interested in media studies, because I think too often we all are kind of guilty of talking in our own inner groups. And so I think too many of us involved in media studies seem to be more at ease at talking among ourselves, and then we get frustrated that nobody else is listening to us.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
And part of my message has been, we have to figure out what the problems are that other people outside our little circle are dealing with, and then show them how what we're doing can solve their problems. Okay? I think that's really important. And so my last book, Scribal Memory and Word Selection, a lot of text critics are really struggling with, how do we think of the text if we don't have an original text?
Right.
And lots of people in text criticism are coming up with the idea that text criticism cannot reconstruct the original text.
Yeah.
And so we'll abandon that and we'll just try to figure earlier and later variants. And I think that's a good thing.
It's a big question. I mean, in my work on Habakkuk, I got to the point where I said, well, what is the book of Habakkuk then?
Right.
Like,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But then if you ask the question, quite a few text critics are unwilling to give up the idea that there was an original text as anachronistic, because they can't figure out how to make sense of it without an original text, because that's the way we've been trained. We can't break out of that. And so part of what I'm trying to do in that book is help them see, look, here's a problem you have because you can't make sense of the text critical evidence. And here's a way of thinking about how oral traditions work in terms of multiformity and textual plurality. And here's how word selection works in everyday conversation that will help you understand why a scribe might change a word. I don't think the scribe would say it's changed anything, but word selection, how does word selection work? To try to help them see that what they're talking about, we need different models, linguistic models, especially cognitive linguistic models, to change the way we think about word selection and what is a text, what is a word, and so forth. So I think that's part of what we have to do. When we attempt to do that, we then have to spend a lot of time defining our terms. And one of my frustrations, and this is not the first time, but the Scribal Memory and Word Selection, that book, it would have been full of scare quotes if I had gotten my way.
What is a scare quote?
Scare quotes are when you put quotations around something that it kind of means so-called variant. So it's a variant, right? Well, okay, when you do this, right? And these are scare quotes, air quotes, scare quotes, And
Yes.
and so when print, we call them scare quotes. I had scare quotes all over the place. Copy editors hate them. And I've had this problem with other projects. And so they take them all out. And then I argue, no, wait a minute. I don't I don't think this is a variant, so I don't want to call it. I want to use scare. Well,
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
define variant here, so you can't use scare quotes anywhere else. Now, that complicates my conversation with scholars when they're reading the book,
Uh-huh.
because the scare quotes are hopefully a way of helping them see you use variant, I'm using variant because you use variant, but I really don't mean variant. I mean, that's
Right.
what it means. And
Yeah.
the problem is we're so stuck with the language that it's really hard for me to
Yeah.
have a conversation with someone when I'm constantly redefining what a word means, what a text means, what a variant is or is not, or so forth. So that's the complicating factor. So we have to work really hard at that language. Now, one thing that I will say, exegeting orality. Okay, come on, really? That's just a bizarre combination of things, right? I mean, but that's the beauty of it, because people are going to look at that and say,
Yes.
what in the world can this guy possibly mean by putting those
Yes.
two things together, right?
Yes.
That makes no sense. So that's
Yes.
part of the difficulty is we're stuck with the language we are given, and the language we're given is defined primarily by the dominant paradigm, and we have to work with that. So finding those problems that other people are dealing with and entering the conversation
Uh-huh.
there, instead of trying to say we're doing something completely new over here that you need to look at,
Right.
is a
Right.
way
Right.
of
Right.
of making those kinds of connections. I think too many of us don't do that well.
Yes. Yeah. And it's such a more helpful way in every way than saying, here's the 10 reasons why you're wrong.
Right. So the book, Empirical Models Challenging Biblical Criticism, boy, that takes it head on, in the sense that this is about source and redaction criticism and what we can
Yes.
know about the criteria and all. I mean, it is certainly written for that audience. And here's what I think about that. And we selected good contributors and put that together. So in one sense, we have to figure out how to meet most biblical scholars on their own terms to show what we're doing can contribute to what they're doing,
Right.
instead of just doing
Yes.
our own little thing over here and we hope you
Yes.
join us, which is an
Right.
easy thing to do. And I think too often we do that.
Uh-huh. Yes.
And
That's
if we
great.
do that, I think people will start to see that methodologically we have to reevaluate what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, people who are involved in text criticism and Dead Sea Scrolls, and those two things are closely connected for those of us in Hebrew Bible,
Oh, sure.
that we need to improve our methodologies. And then I think some of us, we work with the historical critical methods early in our careers, and then we just get kind of fed up with it and we start doing other stuff.
Yeah.
We just do synchronic readings, or we just do, whatever. And it's partly because we're so disillusioned with the historical critical method, but instead of trying to make it better, we just leave it behind.
Well, that is, I know I'm guilty of that, and maybe irretrievably so. Because when I was reading, I had to read Eisfeld or Driver, great minds. But if I'm honest, I came to a lot of those, and I was just like, well, I know that oral traditional studies like just totally transform this. So I'm going to read this to pass my comps, but I'm going to leave this behind and just chase down what the oral traditional approach says, which is not a helpful way to approach it.
Well, I think it's a helpful way early in one's career, but if you stay there, you've isolated yourself from the
Yeah.
bigger conversation.
Yes.
And in some ways that's easier to do. I have to
Uh,
admit, I get so fed up at times reading stuff that I think is so bad methodologically, and it's just kind of like,
it's rough, man.
I mean, yeah, I just, there are certain things that just is like, oh God, I really don't want to do this. I need to engage in some of that to enter into the conversation, though.
Yeah.
That's part of it. I get it.
Yeah.
And
And it's kind. It's there's a level of kindness in it too, like a humility and a love maybe.
yeah, yeah. And getting into the, well, again, you have to be willing to get into some of that minutia.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of us in biblical studies, whether we do media studies or anything else, mostly avoid text criticism.
Hmm.
And I think that division between so-called higher criticism and lower criticism is a big part of the problem. Because if you do higher criticism, you just take the BHS or BHQ or whatever you're working with, and then you do your thing. You don't have to worry about the Septuagint and the Latin and all this other stuff, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and I think just too many of us do that.
Yeah.
And I get it. I understand, but I think we have to overcome those divides between higher and lower criticism. And of course, text critics have been telling us that for a very, very long time, but most of us don't want to hear it because we don't want to have to do the hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh. Dr. Person, I could talk to you for another hour or three, but I know that you've got a farm to tend to and lots of other things. And but I thank you so much for your time. So grateful for the work that you've done, and I know you've got we've mentioned lots of your works, but on top of those, you also are working on a commentary on Jonah. Is that right?
That's the next book. I have a contract with Oxford University Press. They have a new commentary series, Oxford Biblical Commentaries, and so yeah, I've got a full draft. I've got some revising I need to do, but I'm not real sure when I'll get to it since I'm in the middle of teaching. But yeah,
Yeah.
that will be the next book, and it
Well,
will
that's
be
kind of fun. That
interesting.
was your first book, right? And that what you said that was kind of your first
Well, the first book
work,
using conversation analysis,
decision analysis.
applying Jonah,
Yeah.
conversation analysis to Jonah. So I'm returning to Jonah, and
Yeah, that's fun.
that's fun and interesting.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed that. This commentary is a little different in the sense that when you write a commentary, the genre requires you to deal with things like authorship, date
Uh-huh.
of composition, a lot of things that, frankly, a lot of us media studies are happy to avoid.
No, right, right, right. Yes,
Oh,
yes.
and
It's so easy to say at the end. It doesn't matter.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so part of me
Yeah.
in this commentary is like, I just don't want to do the traditional commentary introduction. Just don't make me do it. And
Yes.
you know, the editors, for very good reason, push me to do it. And so
Yes. Yes.
I'm having to say in print things that I might not otherwise say about other books and so forth. Now, I think with
Sure.
Jonah, it's 4 chapters. I really think it's probably one of the few works we have in the biblical text that's a single author. I
Hmm.
make that argument. And it's okay for me to make that. But what's interesting is I talk about my work in media studies and then how, in some ways, I'm writing a commentary on the exception to a whole lot of what I've talked about in my other publications.
All
So it's
right.
kind of an
Sure.
interesting
Yeah.
take on, well, why would you abandon all these other ideas? Well, I actually use Foley to justify some of that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Because he
Uh-huh.
talks about text dependence and genre dependence and tradition dependence and those things, you know. And so I actually think there's a good reason to do that. And actually, what's interesting is Susan Nidich, one of your recent guests,
Mm-hmm.
also has a commentary on Jonah that just recently came out in the
Oh,
Hermaniah
wow.
series. And we reach a lot of the same conclusions, which is not a big surprise.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I get to talk to her in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is yeah. Well, I'm super excited. I'm now I'm going to have to buy 2 commentaries on Jonah. I may have to just preach through Jonah then, I guess. So, yeah.
Good.
Well, I sure appreciate it, Dr. Person,
Thank
and yeah. So make sure anybody who's listening that you just eat up anything from Dr. Person. If you want to have a nuanced approach to media studies and conversation analysis and the Hebrew Bible, this is it. This is it.
Good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Person.
All right.